Great. Thank you, Megan. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very, very much for joining us. I do appreciate you taking the time to check in with us, and welcome to the first annual, hopefully not virtual every year, um, Discount Data and Form 470 training. Um, I've been told many, many times not to start any kind of session of this sort with an apology. So I'm not going to apologize for my ineptitude, but I am going to warn you that I'm a little bit new to leading these kinds of sessions in the online environment. So if I make a few mistakes and stumble, I do beg your apologies. I do want to also mention that I have assisting me today Jody Rose, our CETS engineer from Region 1. He will be, there he is, he will be keeping an eye on our Go Soapbox connection, which I believe our video team will put up the information on how to access that on the screen here in just a moment. But we do have
they'll throw that up. They'll throw that up there, Scott. I was going to say, we got Go Soapbox running today. People are used to that. We're going to use the code 470 E-rate, 470 E-rate lowercase. And if you'll just log into app.gosoapbox.com, I'll do my best to help moderate on the back end and join in occasionally as questions warrant. But we'll try to keep the questions in there and jump back and forth as needed. Thanks, Scott.
Great. Thanks, Jody. Appreciate it. And like I said before, feel free to jump in if something is particularly pertinent to anything that we're talking about at the time. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Over the last day and a half or so, each of you should have received in your email inbox a copy of an updated discount data form with the information populated in it from 2020 funding year, from the current funding year. Many of you are probably already aware that due to the pandemic-related circumstances, the FCC has ruled that because there are difficulties in gathering the relevant data for discount calculations, that the use of the previous year's data for 2021 will be allowable. That means that then your data from 2020 is the data that you are allowed to use. And I would think that in most cases, you will probably be using that data rather than going through the data collection process for 2021, simply because in many, many cases, if not close to all of them, that data has not been collected simply because USDA, the Department of Agriculture that runs the NSLP program, has not been requiring recollection of that data this year for those same set of circumstances. So with that in mind, and also knowing that any Infinite Campus collection that we would normally have conducted this year would have yielded us with minimal results, we went through the process of revising the discount data form just a little bit, and then populated it with the information that it came from the current funding year. So with that in mind, I do want to take some time to go through that, simply because it's really important that, and I've mentioned this in years past, that the data that you have in your EPIC profile, it's really critical that that data match the information that is in the discount data form, and also your data from EPIC automatically gets uploaded into the state's Form 471 application for the state network, which means that then that puts some impetus upon the accuracy of your data feeding into the accuracy of the state application. And of course, the state application ultimately, in the long run, helps provide a good bit of funding for offers of assistance. So you can see that there's a critical connection there from one to the next until you come back to the money that comes back around to you from other places besides E-rate too. So we do appreciate and would ask that you do take the time to carefully review your discount data form. Now, with that in mind, let me pull up a sample discount form, and I will share my screen so that you don't have to look at me all afternoon or all morning, which I'm sure will be a relief. Just for the record, I am wearing pants. but I must admit, it's kind of nice to be able to quick throw on a shirt and tie and come to a meeting and not have to worry about whether anybody can see you from the waist down. It's kind of a nice arrangement.
Scott, you might try that Control Plus and see if we
Sure.
can blow that up just a hair for folks that may have trouble seeing that.
Yeah, we can do the little.
Thank you.
Band. Sure. Thanks. I appreciate that. Okay, so what we see here in front of us is the discount data form, the one that we have sent out to all of you, although obviously it doesn't have the same information. What I have done with this sample is match it up to what is in the organizational profiles of the EPIC training portal that we have access to and that we will be using for demonstration purposes in just a little bit. So you'll see a combination here, or you'll see a connection between what you're seeing here on this sheet and then also what is in EPIC when we go through and review. I am going to take the time to go through this pretty much row by row, line by line, or column by column so that you have a solid understanding of what it is that needs to be contained in each of these fields. Shouldn't take too long, but there are some things, particularly when we get into the world of the community eligibility provision, the CEP option, that we do want to take some time, especially in that, to give some solid information and guidance. In column A, in the second section down, obviously the top section is pretty straightforward. It has district name, USAC district, and or USAC district entity number, your total enrollment for the district, and SLP eligible. Also the percentage, rural and urban designation, and then the category 1 and 2 discount levels based upon the data that is in the second section below it. Second section below it on the far left in column A is your school name. I would ask that you please confirm that the school name listed in the discount data sheet matches with the school name that is in EPIC. That makes it easier not only for tracking things when you might have a PIA review, but also it does help us on the state end of things, because oftentimes if there's a discrepancy in the school name between what we have that you have provided to us in these discount data sheets, which ultimately goes into a collected spreadsheet, an aggregate spreadsheet that we then send to USAC on a yearly basis. When they see those name discrepancies, they start questioning, what school is this, what school is that, and they also, then will add to some additional PIA steps that and responses that need to be provided in instances like that. So to try and, as much as we can, circumvent that kind of situation, it's helpful to have that school name match on the discount data sheet as to what it is listed in EPIC. If it is correct on the discount data sheet, but the name is incorrect in EPIC, we would encourage you and ask that you contact the Schools and Libraries Customer Service Bureau and ask them to change the name for you so that they do match. And I do believe that is required. It's a required step to call them to change that. I don't believe you can change the name itself of the location in your EPIC profile. If you can, well, we can test that here in just a minute. It's not something I've honestly tried to do anytime recently, so I'm not absolutely certain whether or not that can be done by yourself or if it has to be done by by personnel from USAC. We talk about those names and matching things up. You also want to make sure that your name matches up correctly with the USAC supplied entity number so that those things go together, because that's really the only way to cross-reference them is to make sure that if those names don't match, that at the very least, that the entity numbers match. That's obviously very important. Column C in that second section asks whether the location is considered rural or urban. Those designations were set very early on when EPIC was introduced. So there probably will be no changes to those. Those can be disputed if you believe that one of those or more are incorrect in terms of your urban and rural status. You can certainly contest those, and you have the opportunity to check in with USAC, their Client Services Bureau, our Customer Service Bureau, and have that changed if you can demonstrate, in fact, that location is rural rather than urban. That is obviously important when it comes to determining your overall discount percentage for both Category 1 and Category 2. The rural designation can mean an increase in certain situations of a 10% discount. So certainly that's worth taking a look at, especially if you're very close to having more than half of your schools being rural. Certainly it might make a difference, so it'd be worth taking a look at. Whether the district is considered urban or rural overall is determined by whether or not more than half, that is, 6 out of 10 if you had 10. 5 out of 10 would not qualify. That's only 50%. It has to be 51% or more of your schools being considered rural in order for the district as a whole to be considered rural. Now, on to column D. Column D is the total NSLP eligible students as reported through Infinite Campus. And then, of course, with this being last year's data, presumably you would have taken a look at this data last year, but we would ask that you, once again, take a look at it again this year, make sure that it is consistent from one year to the next if you're going to be using last year's data. But this is the information that's been provided in last year's data form and was also should have been placed into EPIC. That's a pretty simple process. That's based upon the collection of NSLP forms, et cetera, or the household income forms if that was the direction that your district took to gather that data in the first place. Column E is obviously total enrollment, and that's pretty simple. That's pretty straightforward. That too came from, initially at least, from Infinite Campus and the entries that were made last year to that tool. Once again, double check that, make sure that that jives with what you've got, but those numbers were not changed during the course of revising this discount data sheet. And by the way, for what it's worth, the things that changed about the discount data sheet, because you're probably looking at it and thinking, well, this looks almost exactly like the one we had from last year. Well, it's pretty close. We did remove a few columns. One of them was the NCES code. While that can be used as something to cross-reference schools and school names and whatnot, quite honestly, in the 5, now 6 years, this is, I think, the 6th year of the existence of EPIC as a portal for entering discount data and filing forms. I have literally never used the NCES code to do any kind of cross-referencing or matchup. Also, when you get into EPIC, you'll note that it is an optional field. So rather than belabor the point or have folks worry or be concerned about that going forward, I simply removed it from the data collection process. So we removed that. We also removed a couple of columns in the middle that were related to Category 2 and part-time students. New rules that were passed by the FCC have, in association with changing some of the way that Category 2 operates. You may recall from about a year and a half ago, we had a session where we had an FCC report and order that was issued around Category 2 that made some changes to it. One of which was the elimination of the counting of any kind of part-time students. So I removed any reference to part-time students. There were a couple of columns that were associated with that. And then I also removed the column that was discussing or asked about new school construction. That also is one that we've not had really, I think, more than one or two questions about in the past 5-6 years. So we pulled that as well. So we're through the basics. If you do not have a school or set of schools in your district that are CEP participants, then you can probably take a quick 5-10 minute break while I get into talking about CEP for a few minutes. But certainly you want to be at least awake enough to recognize that when we're done, so that you can pick back up and follow back along. But most of you, based upon having gone through all of the discount data forms in the last couple of weeks, most of you have at least one participating CEP school. The community eligibility provision of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's National School Lunch Program provides for allowing a school to feed all of its students without respect to whether or not all of the students are identified as eligible for free or reduced cost lunch. This is based upon participation is based upon whether or not 40+% of the student population, that is your enrollment essentially, can be identified as being eligible through the identification of a participation in some other form of support program that their household may be in part or participating in. Things like SNAP and Medicaid and a few others. If a student's household is participating in one of those qualifying programs, they are automatically identified as being eligible for school free and reduced lunch, and they are included in that CEP percentage. Now, one clarification, and something that we did add to this spreadsheet, are those little letters ISP in column G in that top section, where it says CEP direct cert percentage. This ISP, we added this because there has been in the past a little bit of confusion around what that percentage is supposed to be. But ultimately, what it comes down to is that when either beginning participation or renewing participation in the CEP program, your food service folks are asked to report the identified student percentage, the ISP. Now that ISP is normally going to be, normally you see numbers ranging from 45 or so to 65 or 70. What we have found is that occasionally the percentages that folks will enter in this area or in this part of the spreadsheet are percentages that have actually been calculated and multiplied times the multiplier that is used for calculating the amount of reimbursement for USDA. And that is one step too far when it comes to entering this percentage. This needs to be the specific identified student percentage, or ISP. That is a term that your food service personnel should be very attuned to and clued in on. So if you ask them for that information, they should be able to provide that for you for each of your schools. But make sure that they are providing you with a number that has not had the multiplier applied to it yet. That multiplier will actually get applied to some figures farther on down the road in this spreadsheet, and we'll do some calculations for you rather than you having to worry about whether or not you've set it up and made the correct math. We've made sure that that math is built into the functionality of the spreadsheet. So for those schools that are participating in CEP and you are choosing to use CEP data for discount calculations, column G is where you'll place that ISP or that direct cert percentage. Worthy of note is that you are not required to use CEP data for calculating your discounts. Just because a school is participating in CEP does not mean that you are required to use CEP in the discount calculation process. Now, that having been said, that will bring us over to, I'm going to skip column H for a second and jump over to column I. There is a multiplier that is used in calculating not only the reimbursement for your district from USDA, but also in calculating the discount amount for or percentage for each school and the total number of overall students eligible for NSLP. This has to do with the fact that when you calculate the ISP, that identified student percentage, they're looking for only students who qualify for those national programs of support, which means that students whose households perhaps have an income above the threshold for participation in those programs, it is possible that they are above the threshold for participation in those programs, but still below the threshold for receiving a reduced cost lunch, which means that essentially then the number of students that would be counted based upon that ISP alone would be lower potentially than the total number of students that would be eligible for free and reduced cost lunch. In order to account for that, the USDA has decided that you take that ISP and you multiply it times 1.6. The E-rate folks, FCC and USAC decided, well, FCC decided that that they would employ the same factor and the same multiplier in calculating the discounts for rate as well. So what you do essentially is what happens in the background is that your total enrollment is then ultimately multiplied times a factor of the ISP times 1.6, which means that ultimately if you have 62.5% or so ISP or higher, your NSLP eligible based on the multiplier over here in column I is actually going to be the exact same as your total enrollment. Once you reach about 63% of an ISP, once you multiply it times the 1.6 multiplier, that means that essentially everybody in the district is considered eligible for free and reduced lunch, and they all get calculated and counted in the data for purposes of calculating your discount percentage overall. The base year is the year in which the ISP that you are using was established. Now, that having been said, that could be any number of years because the ISP can be established in year one of participation in CEP, and then it can, if that ISP goes up, it can be reset and recalculated every year or every other year or any time that its increase provides a benefit to the district in terms of reimbursements and whatnot from USDA. So that number and that date that goes with it may from time to time change. So what you want to make sure that you're placing in that CEP base year is the year in which that ISP was calculated. Now, the ISP is usually reported, to my knowledge, it's only reported in April or October of any given year. You don't need to worry about, for column H, placing an April or an October. We know just by the definition of the way the rules are established that would have been established in April or October of the given year that you've provided. So you don't need to be specific on a date or even a month in a year. Just the year itself is all that is required with respect to that particular entry. When you get to entering your ISP after your total enrollment's in, you put in your base year, you notice that then the spreadsheet, actually I'll just take this out for a second so that we can show you what happens. You can see then that the multiplier is calculated automatically based upon this ISP that you enter. And then what we ask you to do, because the total NSLP eligible students gets calculated up here based upon the total listed in column D below it, we need to make sure that you take the number from column I and also copy it over, or you can just type it in and make sure that then those two match. I and D should match when for each of the CEP participating schools. Now, that having been said, there is a slight discrepancy for whatever reason, and still can't figure this out, between the way that EPIC calculates and rounds this total number of NSLP eligible students based upon the multiplier, and it does it differently than Excel does. For whatever reason, occasionally you will find that this number in column D might be 1 or perhaps as much as 2, depending upon how many students you have in the district, above the CEP NSLP based multiplier that is column I. If you find that that is the case, for example, if you type in your 42.11 and in EPIC this shows up as 454, we would ask you that you just change that to 454. If there's a 1 student discrepancy between column D and column I for a school that is a CEP participant, we know automatically why that's occurring and what that is a result of. So there's no need to fret over it, certainly, but the best thing to do for everybody involved is to make sure that column D is what matches exactly what is in EPIC, whereas this is as much for reference and ease of calculation to make sure that you've made the calculation correctly or that you've entered your discount percentage correctly, either in the spreadsheet or in EPIC. If the school is a juvenile justice facility, there needs to be a Y next to that school. We don't have any examples here of that. A number of your districts, I think most districts, maybe about 60–70% of them have 1. A couple of them have 2 juvenile justice facilities. No need to bother taking the time to put an N in for each of those if they're not. Same thing applies to column K. No reason to put an N in for all of those, just a Y if in fact that is the case. So for example, if you used for let's say row 11, school B, you use the household income forms rather than the NSLP form. You can just put a Y in there because those household income forms are technically not NSLP forms, and that's what this count is supposed to be, unless otherwise indicated, in which case we need to make sure that there is a Y in that alternate discount method. It's essentially the same process. I know that you're gathering the same data, but from USAC's perspective, it is not exactly the same data. They don't consider it the same thing. So you are obviously allowed to use those household income forms to make your counts, but you do need to indicate that you used something other than the NSLP form or CEP in order to calculate the information that is contained in EPIC and on these sheets. Jody, I'll throw it over to you real quick to see if there are any questions at this point.
Well, there are a few things, Scott, and some of them may be in the category of things you're going to get to. Sure. I'll go ahead and mention what we've had so far. I guess the first one, let me get one out of the way. There was one user that noted maybe wanting you to go through the process of creating a new school entity, just where they've got something like that. Maybe I'm thinking maybe we can hold that one to the end. If you want to hang around afterward, you might demo that, or else we could do that during one of the office hours. We've had several districts that have want to make sure that we cover this whole concept of counting students at area technology centers now that the whole part-time thing has changed. I'm assuming you're planning to get to that. That is something that several people have asked about. I want to make sure we know how to handle those counts for students in that scenario. And then also just clarifying about whether or not this year the student number, if that sets like your Category 2 budget for that entire 5-year cycle, which I assume is something you're going to get to as well. So those are the things that I've seen so far.
Okay, well, let's kind of just go ahead and tackle them at this point.
Sure.
As far as the ATCs are concerned, I think with the exception of only maybe 1 or 2 districts, the way that folks have been reporting that up till now will continue to be essentially the same way. What our guidance has been and what USAC's guidance has been previously is that for purposes of calculating the Category 1 and 2 discount percentages, that is your discount percentages, as opposed to your budget, 2 different things. For calculating the discount percentage, you need to make sure that every student is only counted once. And you count that school essentially at their quote unquote home school. That would mean then that essentially at this point, your D and E columns for your ATC row on this spreadsheet, if we had an ATC here, we'll just ATV. That sounds like more fun than ATC, doesn't it? That you would have zeros here. Why? Because students that go to the ATC are already counted at school A or B. Their home school is where they are counted for purposes of establishing these discount percentages. That will continue to be the case. What's different is that there will be no, there will be no Category 2 budget established for those schools based upon the number of students there. They will still be eligible for Category 2, but it will be at the base rate of what has now been bumped, I think, to $25,000. If I'm not mistaken, that is the new funding floor for buildings that have fewer than 149 students. There's 149 and fewer students. A slight difference there, but so essentially, yeah, your ATC reporting is going to remain the same as far as the numbers and the counts are concerned. So that process has not changed.
So for Cat 1 or for Cat 2, so let's just to throw some numbers in here. I've got an area technology center. 300 kids attend there. 100 of them are mine, and 200 are kids that come in part of the day from another district. You're saying that that area technology center, those 100 kids, they're part of your high school or whatever, so they're already being counted in your high school for the discount rate purposes. And then those other 200 kids that come from another district, they don't really factor into your district's discount level.
Correct.
So that's what you're saying for the Category 1 perspective. From a Category 2 perspective, talk a little bit about what that would mean in that example with that area technology center that has 300 total part-time students, none of which are enrolled at full-time at that facility.
Right, and with no full-time enrollment and with the elimination of the counting of part-time students, that location is essentially now sitting at the floor of enrollment, and that location will then only be eligible for the floor level of funding. That is to say, the $25,000 for that building. Now, that having been said, and we'll get a little bit into this probably a little bit later, is that with respect to the Category 2 budget, there may be instances where larger districts that have an ATC that also have more than 10 buildings in the district will essentially, unfortunately, as a result of the way that the rules were written, see absolutely no funding based upon that building itself. But remember that those kids are still going to be counted overall, and your Category 2 budget is still going to be based on the number of students you have overall. And so you're still getting funding based upon having and teaching those students. It's just not based on that building. In addition to that, because of the way that Category 2 has been restructured, you have a Category 2 district budget, which means that you are allowed to spend those Category 2 dollars in a fashion that meets your needs, no matter which building or which school, I should say. I should be careful about using that term building, but which school you are spending the funds on. So you're free to apply and utilize those funds in a manner that best suits the local need, rather than being pigeonholed into, well, this particular building has a budget of $17,500, and I have to spend that $17,500 only for services that are provided to this particular building. You no longer have to go through that process. So there's a little bit of a balance out, I think, in terms of you feel like you're losing some and gaining some all at the same time. There might be a small differential in overall dollars, but
and I apologize for jumping in. I'm getting questions as you explain this. So just to clarify, in the case, in the old way of doing things, I worried about counting that total number of part-time students, whether they were part of my district or whether they were part of a neighboring district. But you're saying with the new way and the inability to count part-time students, I would treat area technology centers essentially as you have on the share there, with zero enrollment, unless for some reason those students are enrolled at that facility rather than a high school, for example. Whether they are my students or not, the fact that I've got 200 kids coming in part-time, that just doesn't even factor in for the discount data perspective with the new rules.
That's correct. That's exactly right.
I'll tell you what, then we'll come back to that if we need to. I know I'd mentioned earlier, and if you're going to get to this later, that's fine. I'd had a question as well about, does this year set the student number that will be used in the calculation of the Cat 2 funding?
I knew there was one more and I couldn't remember it. Thank you. It will set it for this first year, but FCC has indicated that going forward, you will have the option to reset that Category 2 budget again for future years, should you find that there's an increase in the number of students. With the use of last year's, or the permission of use of last year's data for the very first year of the funding or the new budget cycle, it's possible, and this has not been ruled upon yet by the FCC, but it is possible that they may end up deciding that if you used last year's numbers to calculate your Category 2 budget for this year, that they may require you to do one more year of entering that. But basically what you're going to have, aside from the COVID issues that kind of complicate things a little bit, if we were coming into this year fresh and you had all brand new data, you would be establishing the baseline for your Category 2 funding with the numbers that you have now. You would have the option in future years to stay with your baseline number or to change that number if it increases in a given year within the 5-year budget cycle. We'll take a look at this as we get into the process of entering this into Epic.
Yeah, while you're pulling that up, I'm recalling what we talked about at KISTI last year. Obviously, that was pre-COVID. I mean, if I were strategizing for a district, if you're in declining enrollment, it would make sense to set your budget now so that budget stays as it is, as you are unfortunately losing students. If I'm in a district with growing enrollment, then you can request with USAC to recalculate that. all of that guidance was kind of pre-COVID, and it sounds like we kind of remains to be seen if they might force us to get a new count because of the circumstances
Yep.
that we find ourselves in now. Is that right?
That's exactly what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying. You do a nice job of saying much more succinctly anything that I ever do. That's a skill I need to work on. And used to blame me for that too.
As far as the soapbox goes, Scott, I know we had the question also about going through the process of requesting a new entity. Do we want to like table that to the end? Would that be best?
I'll just say, yeah, no, I'll just say real quick with respect to that, and then we can also come back to it, like you suggested, perhaps during an open house tomorrow or an office hours tomorrow or Friday. But I will say that if you have a new school that's opened up or that you're about to open up, the very first step, if you haven't already done so, is to contact client services and ask them to create a new building for you in your Epic profile. So that when you get to your Epic profile, let me pull that up. So that when you get to your Epic profiles and you look at your landing page, that new location is listed under My Entities. That's the first thing to do, is to get it included in Epic. The other thing to do then would be to add that location to a new row on the sheet. Assuming that you have an available space, just use the last available space and type in the name and the USAC entity number. That's the number that will be assigned to that location by USAC when you ask them to create the new location. So whatever that number is, please make sure that you enter that into column B, and then the other data. I think we've already kind of covered the process of entering that, so that shouldn't be too much more beyond that.
Yeah, and we can go through how to request that, entity of USAC. I did get a question along the way too, and this may be one of those one-off situations, Scott, that we may just have to either take offline, or if you know the answer right now, that's fine. If I'd had a school that just this year became a CEP school, and then you've got, of course, the situation with questionable data. What am I even using? Can I use last year's? And so the question was, they just qualified this summer, but with the extended fee program, do I still just need to use the same discount data as last year, even though it was not a CEP school last year? We might have to take that one offline to get a very specific situation on how to handle that with that one school in that district. But just the timing of being recently categorized CEP, my instinct is, well, if you've got that data, then you're going to be reporting very recent data on this discount data that you're returning. But we may have to take that one offline as far as the timing. I'm not describing that one particularly well, but
yeah, I'm gonna suggest that let's table that one for now. But because I'm 98% sure that I know the answer to it, but I want to be 100% sure before I jump in and step on my own toes and say something wrong, and then of course this being recorded and so on and so forth. I don't want to throw misinformation out there. So yeah, let's go ahead and table that one for now, and then let's be sure to circle back to whomever has the question so that we can be sure to give them the guidance that they need.
Fair enough. You're ready to proceed.
All righty, great. I've probably already talked way too long. We're already at 10:45. My goodness. All right, so the process of entering this data into Epic is fairly simple if you know the right places to click. So when you first log into Epic, it drops you into your landing page. In terms of changing the discount data, you'd scroll down and click on any of the schools in your district if anything needs to be changed. And we've talked about that. It may or may not need to be changed. If you have data that is collected from this year, and you feel comfortable with it, and you have supporting documentation locally, you are not required to use last year's data. You are not. So you can use this year's data, but I think that the important thing is going to be consistent to where you're using your data. Either you're using data for each of your schools from last year or this year. I don't recommend. In fact, this is kind of comes back to that question we just had. is I think it would be potentially problematic to have some data that's from this year and some data that's from last year when it comes to your discount calculations. So that having been said, I certainly encourage you to use data from this year if you A, have it, and B, if it improves your overall calculations, whether that be category 1 or category 2. So when you get here and you need to double check all your data, or you need to make any changes, you click on that school name from the list of entities on the landing page, and it brings you to an overall summary of this page. If you scroll down, you'll note that on the right-hand side, you can see that there is the information here that you have entered or has already been entered for you, including CEP, the base year. If there's base year, it has the number of full-time students, otherwise known as your enrollment, and the number of students eligible for the National School Lunch Program, based upon in this case, based upon your CEP multiplier. If it's not, then it's just a straight up number of students eligible that you have entered. So if you have changes that need to be made to this, you need to click the button on the upper right that says Manage Organization, and this will allow you then to have the access that you need to make changes to the data. If you scroll down, you have your CEP percentage. You have whether or not the school is a CEP school or not. If it's not, it's going to look like this. There we go. And then notice that it has a drop down for whether or not you're using an alternative discount method. If you are using an alternative discount method, for example, if you collected the household income forms, select survey from this drop down menu, because that's what they consider anything that is not an NSLP form that collects the same information. Note also that you can do sibling matches, et cetera, or combinations, as long as it's not in combination with CEP. If it is a CEP school, you'd make sure that upper radio button under that question is checked off. You'd enter your total number of students. You'd enter your CEP percentage. We can just use a different number this time if we want to, and see how those numbers change. And then your CEP base year. Interestingly enough, we've already run into a question where somebody said, my last year's data, which makes sense, my 2020 data was based on 2015 CEP, or 2016 CEP. What do I do now? Well, that's a good question. So that's one of those things that I don't have an answer to at this moment, but certainly you have an opportunity to potentially update your CEP numbers so that it's at least a possibility that might improve your situation and your standing rather than keeping you where you are. We will be looking for, and I will be seeking, some additional guidance from USAC on what to do in that situation, since we've had it come up. So if you are in that situation yourself, certainly good thing to do would be to give me a holler and let me know that you're in that situation so that I can be sure to get the guidance to you that you will need. But that's where you select your drop-down menu for your CEP base year. This is all where you're going to, again, you're going to make any changes. The school type, that is the check all that apply, what kind of school or what kinds of particular information on that school needs to be included. For ATCs, because you're going to use that 00 You need to make sure that the school is categorized as a general use school rather than any of these others. And you don't want to leave that blank because you still want to have that school counted when possible and when useful for your Category 2 budgets. So you do want to make sure that your ATCs have that general use school. That's a new categorization that has come up this year specifically for instances of schools that have only part-time attendees, but they are still considered full schools in terms of their operation and designation. And then down at the bottom, you can make your changes. You can submit your changes by clicking the submit button, and it should take you. Let's see, it takes you. Yeah, you can give the modification that you just gave a nickname. You could probably make the name the nickname of your modification something like DD or discount data changes 2021, something like that. That's going to help you remember why you made the change that you made. This, of course, being a demonstration, I'm just using made up names as we go along. So then you save that modification and it brings you back to the page of the summary for that particular school. You'd need to go through this process, of course, for each of your schools. And for what it's worth, to get out of this and get back to your landing page as quickly as possible, probably the easiest thing to do is either click news or reports. I just click reports. And it takes me to an option to see my landing page. So reports will always give you this landing page as your first option out of just about anything. So reports, landing page, and then it takes you back to your landing page. You'd go through that same process for for each of your schools, just to make sure that you've essentially validated and confirmed the numbers and data for each of your schools. Now, there's another element of this that we need to make sure that everybody's comfortable with, and that is the Category 2 options that you have. So what I've done is from my landing page, I clicked on the name of the district. And if we scroll down, you'll notice that at the bottom of this, it's going to give you an option for whether or not you want to use the district, one number for the district as a whole to calculate your Category 2 budget, or whether you want a number for each school in the district to be used. So those of you with 10 or fewer schools, you will have the option to use this separate number for each school in the district. Unfortunately, for schools that are larger than or for districts that have more than 10, and these are instructional buildings, by the way. This does not include non-instructional facilities. This is only schools. So that may make a difference as to whether you do or don't qualify, just so that you're aware of that. But if you have more than 10 schools in your district, you will only be allowed to use this one number for my whole district option. But if you have fewer, and it would do you good, let's say that you have 5 regular, quote unquote, regular schools and an alternative program, and your alternative program only has 45 students. That's obviously well under the 149 student threshold for acquiring the base level of, or the floor level of funding for that building. So when you start adding up all of your buildings, each building based upon the number of students there is going to have its own budget amount contributing to the total. Then you get to that alternative program, and normally 45 students times the 169 per student would give you something less than 25,000. So if you choose to go building by building to calculate that overall number, what it will do is if there's fewer than 149 students, or 149 and fewer, that the amount that's calculated into the overall budget for that building itself is going to be 25,000 rather than whatever the enrollment times 169 per student is. I hope that makes sense. It's
you're hitting it, and it is super important. And so
yeah.
I'll take an effort to actually live up to that reputation you gave me earlier. If you've got more than 10 schools, tough luck. This rule does not apply to you. It's unfortunate, but they just assume that larger districts, you're going to have one total for the whole district, and that's your budget. If you've got 10 schools or less, look at your discount data, and if any of those schools have less than 150 students, he gave the great example with like the alternative setting or day treatment or any of these kind of little separate. You may have a very small school, just a traditional school, but if you've got a non-traditional type school that has a low enrollment, if you've got any of those under 150, then go in and choose that, because that's going to help you from an overall budget perspective. And you said you do that, what, Scott, by going and picking the district and then scrolling down? I'll let you walk through that again.
Yep. Yeah, that's fine. From the landing page, you'd scroll down, and yes, you would select the district as an entity, not one of the schools. So we select the district entity. It will take us to the summary page. You scroll down and wait a minute, there's grayed out. Yeah, well, in order to be able to edit that information, you need to actually use this ellipses drop-down menu at the top where it says Manage Organization. So you click that drop-down menu, click on Manage Organization. This will now then open the page for updating. Then obviously you can make changes to the information here, as well as phone numbers, locations, emails, et cetera, if you need to do that. The type of school, not that any of these is probably going to change, it probably won't, but then as we scroll down, you can see that then we have the option to, there's no longer grayed out, we have an option to use the number based upon each of the schools in the district. And then should see, once you do that, you should see the full breakdown of each school and how many students they are contributing to that overall number.
Well, and you've had a couple of people kind of chime in the soapbox, Scott. I mean, it's if you're at that unfortunate breakdown where you've got 10 schools and the ATC makes you 11, that ATC is an instructional facility, right? So that's going to put you at that larger total, right?
That's a serious bummer, but yeah.
And then, as somebody else just commented in the soapbox, if all your schools are 150 or greater, then both options are going to get the same total. So it's really less of a criticality. I will mention, because this was brought up, it's a great clarification. I'm actually interested to see how you answer this, Scott, because I've got my own thoughts. We've used a phrase through this session, and it's important to clarify. We have the ability to use last year's numbers or last year's data. And so when we say that, are we talking about only the discount rate, or are we also talking about the enrollment for that previous year?
Yes, the enrollment and the number of students eligible needs to be coming from the same year. You cannot combine last year's enrollment with this year's NSLP. Now, you want to make sure that you are consistent with that year over year. So when I say last year's data, I'm just referring to the data that was used in conjunction with applying for funding for 2020.
But you're talking about across the board enrollment and the discount rates, and I think that answer clarifies why there's a little uncertainty about moving forward. Because if I can go back a previous year and that affects me for 5 years moving forward, that may be a factor in whether or not FCC and USAC determined that we need to have a new count next year, but with COVID and everything else. But when we say last year's numbers, that means across the board, last year's numbers, you can use those enrollment and all. Thank you.
Yes, and that was what was provided in the discount data forms that went out in the last 36 hours. Excellent. Any others while we got you on the line there, Jody? I'll take that as a no. Or maybe you're talking to nobody because you're muted.
Well, all right, you got me. I'm doing the mute unmute thing. Yeah,
Sorry,
I'm reading so
I'm
many
picking
awesome
on you.
words here. So yeah, the interesting question here. I think I know the answer again, but is it possible to not ask for money for a building to get under that limit of 10? That answer is pretty much no, right? I mean, we're counting instructional facilities you have and the enrollment thereof, and honestly, it does help. But if you look at the math for all of that, like the level to which it helps is it may not be as great as you think. It is a help to have that $25,000 floor for a small facility, but I would not want to run the risk of doing too much gamesmanship just to try to gain a few extra dollars in the E-rate program. There are too many boxes you check and too many penalties for getting caught being dishonest about it all. Great question here, Scott. By what date do changes need to be made in Epic? When will we be locked out?
That is a really good question that I really wish we had an answer to.
Well,
But
but
unfortunately,
you can
we
summarize.
don't.
It's going to be before or around
Yes.
the time the
Yeah.
window opens, right? So
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's where I was going with that. Yeah, the in previous years, well, first of all, you can make changes to your Epic profiles right now. They are open and they are accessible. The window in which to make those changes will close probably 3 to 4 days ahead of the opening of the Form 471 window. So if the Form 471 window is opening on January 15th, likely somewhere around January 10th, you'll see the administrative window close, and that's what we refer to as the time when you can make changes to your organizational profiles, is that administrative window. So yeah, the admin window will close a few days before the opening of the Form 471 window, and until then, between now and then, you can make any of these changes necessary. And of course, as a result, with it being the time that everything is open, now is the time to add any new buildings that you need to add or make any adjustments, because once you get past the close of that window, making changes to that becomes far more complicated and involves calls to client services and a few others to make sure that those things get worked out the way that they need to. All righty, so then I think we've talked about that. I think we're ready to, unless there's any additional questions, ready to jump into. I'd say I'm not asking to leave. Oh, of course it's asking me to leave because I'm still in the edit phase of this, aren't I? Okay, so yeah, we'll just go and say yes. And the other way to get back to your landing page is that any page that has the logo for USAC in the upper left-hand corner, that logo will always take you back to your landing page. So then we'll do a quick demonstration. We've talked about now entering all of our discount data. Let's move on to looking at the Form 470 and requesting services for the upcoming funding year. So that upper right-hand corner, you saw me click on the words Form 470. This will take you directly to beginning a new Form 470. It's going to ask you for a nickname. We'll just call this application Nick. Somebody else can give him a name. So enter the nickname, something that's going to, and you know, I'm sort of jokingly entering, you know, silly names, but obviously here's a good example of where you really do want to select a nickname that is going to help you remember what it is that's in the Form 470 that you're applying for here, or the services that you're applying for here. You know, this might be instead, you might do FY 2021 least lit fiber requests, something along those lines, so that you know what it is that you're going to be requesting under this particular Form 470. Save and continue. Now it's going to give you a couple of pages worth of verifications. You know, is this your district? Do you have general public or public schools, general use? It's going to show you just some basic data about the district and the recipients of service. There's literally nothing to enter on this page. Save and continue. It's going to ask you if you are associated with a consulting firm. If you are, this is where you would select them. I think you would do that based upon the consulting firm's consultant registration number. Then the question also is asked, are you the main contact person? If you are the main contact person, it will automatically pull in your information. If you are not the main contact person, the person who is the main contact person must be an Epic user for the Form 470 contact. So this would have to be somebody that is already a user. Let's see. I'll click that, and then obviously that gets pulled in directly from your user profiles. So easy enough. Obviously that's the same because there's only one user in this instance of the training profile. If you get to this point and it's somebody else, and you need to enter them, but they are not a user, you can save you can save the application, select one, you can save, you can come back after saving and continuing, and then you can exit out of the Form 470 and go add that person as a user and then come back in. If anybody needs to see how that process occurs, let me know and we can run through that when everything is all said and done. But basically, managing users and managing organizations, et cetera, are pretty similar as you jump off from that landing page. There's, for most of them, in the upper right-hand corner is where you'll find the links to begin those processes. The Form 470 is unique to E-Rate in the sense that you are allowed to apply for or request services within both Category 1 and Category 2 on the same form. You can. I'm not so sure it's that good an idea, but you have the ability to select both of these if you so choose. I tend to think that it's probably not best practice, but that may be more the way my brain works rather than anybody else's, which is unique. There's no question about that. But the reason I suggest perhaps wanting to keep Category 1 and Category 2 separate is because you may have, in a world that is less than the best of all possible, if you filed a Form 470 that has both Category 1 and Category 2 on it, and let's say, for example, that something got held up in your Category 1 in the review of your Form 471 that referenced this Form 470 for Category 1. What may happen as a result is if there are problems with the Form 470 associated with your Category 1 side of things, it could end up holding up anything that's associated with Category 2 funding and funding requests because it gets stuck under Category 1. Of course, you could flip the switch and say the same sort of thing could occur for Category 2 versus Category 1. Yeah, that's exactly right. It could. This is why I feel like it's better to have something closer to a Category 1, a 1-to-1 ratio between your 470s and your 471s, essentially, so that they remain fairly well separated, so that if something goes wrong with one, it doesn't ultimately impact the others in the different categories. That having been said, for ease of demonstration purposes, I am going to right now go ahead and just click Category 2 on there as well, so that you can see what it looks like, and then also so that we can run through an example of each. So we've selected the categories, we save and continue. Is there an RFP for this service? RFPs are not required for anything except for filing for dark fiber service or self-provisioned fiber service. We talked about those last week during our fiber-related session, and if you have questions about those, I would first refer you to the video that, honestly, right now I'm working with our help desk to try and make sure that somehow that gets posted in a way that everybody can view it. So we're working on that. It is a known issue that it's not viewable by everyone. But certainly, if you need to have access to that, or if you have questions about fiber and RFPs, certainly feel free to give me a call or drop me an email, and we'll even if that video isn't up and working yet, we'll try and help you get through and sort through your questions. That having been said, the fiber and where there's a requirement for RFPs aside, there's two different situations. One is you may have a rather complex project, and in having a complex project, you feel like it's a good idea, and in a complex project, it probably is a good idea to include something at least akin to an RFP, a project fact sheet or a project requirements sheet, something that provides a view of the project in a manner that is more descriptive than what you can fit into a 2,000 character narrative. So it can help to have an RFP, particularly for those more complicated kinds of projects that you may be involved in. So if there is that kind of thing, whether it's an RFP, the other instance, and I'm sure are aware of this from your own local rules, is that if your own local rules require an RFP for certain types of procurements, that you would also then click yes and add your RFP to it. So if you are under those circumstances, you click yes. It then provides you with an upload document. I can take this and this and this. And yeah, here we go. And you can just drag and drop your file and put it into the, drop it into Epic, and it will upload it automatically for you once you drop it here. You can come back later and click off of that. Notice that I called this one RFP placeholder. If you think you're going to have or need an RFP, you can drop in a placeholder and then it holds its place. And later on, then you can come in and upload the actual RFP and then use your X button, and it will delete this particular older version of the placeholder of the RFP. I like to have that placeholder there just because if I don't have an actual copy of the full RFP, I can move forward and continue on with my 470 without having to wait for the final version of it. And you'll see that on this next page, you'll understand why. And that is that when it comes to this, it asks you on this next page, especially if you have multiple documents that you want to have associated with your request, you then click on either one of these and let folks know that that RFP is associated with the your Category 1 or Category 2 services that you are requesting on this Form 470. Enough about RFPs. Let's move on to Category 1. Here's where you have your narrative. In our Category 1 service requests, I think we said we were going to do a quick demo of lit fiber. So let's add a new service request, and we will ask for lit fiber. Now, you can see that it provides you with a really nice breakdown of how to seek bids for the different services. It's basically letting you know which one of these drop downs, because each of these is in the drop down menu. There you go. And you select from that list the one that most closely fits what it is that you're looking for. And I think in most cases, there's going to be an exact fit or something that's very, very close. But in the example of the least lit fiber, you would use that as your drop down. It's going to ask you for a quantity. You notice that the units is already in place for you. So it's asking you for the number of circuits that you would need. I think we had 3 buildings in this particular. Actually, it might end up being 2. It's just the total number of circuits that you would be requesting as a result of this service request. It then asks you for a minimum capacity. A minimum capacity. Well, we don't want anything slower than say 500 megs. And we know that we really won't ever need anything anytime soon, at least, above, say, 25 gigs. So you're essentially asking for bidders to come back to you with pricing on a range of speeds. This is important. Why? Because let's say, for example, that all you did was you put in, well, I just want 1 gig. So that's all I'm going to ask for is 1 gig. So there's my minimum, maximum, and my potential bidders they're going to come back and they're going to ask for they're going to give me a pricing on what 1 gig for 2 circuits is going to cost. Here's the thing about taking that approach. If you do so and you have a contract that results from it, and let's just say, for example, that this is a 3-year contract. If in year 2 or even year 3 of the contract, you determine that you need more than 1 gig of service or whatever amount you requested, you will have a situation where you cannot, under the rules, ask for on a 471 any more than the maximum capacity that you got pricing for based upon the Form 470 that you requested it in. Meaning that you would be stuck at 1 gig even though you might need 2, 5, or 10. All of a sudden, if all of a sudden the number of devices goes up in your buildings, and all of a sudden you realize, wow, we're really bumping our heads. But if you didn't ask for a range that goes above your perceived level of need at this current time, you have no way of jumping up to a level of service that provides you with meeting your needs based upon those speeds. So what you would be in then a situation is you would either have to, in order to remedy that situation, you would either have to go back out to bid, or you might be in a situation where you're stuck with that because the terms of your contract are such that you would be held in breach of contract if you were to go back out and bid and not follow through on the purchase of those services under the terms of the contract. Now, obviously, that calls into question, well, how did you structure your contract and what kinds of terms of service are in it? Yeah, that's true. But if you build into the Form 470 some flexibility in terms of the speeds that you're requesting, while you might only need 1 gig this year, if you asked for pricing on 2 gigs and 5 gigs and 10 gigs, you can move up to that speed as long as your winning contractor provided you with pricing on those, and they're still willing to honor that pricing, because that pricing was reviewed during the course of your bid evaluation for this particular Form 470. So I recommend always, always, always ask for, whoops, I did it backwards. Always ask for a range of speeds on the services that you're asking for, particularly with respect to least lit fiber. Number of entities served, might be two in this case. Are you also seeking installation, activation, and initial config for this service? I always recommend you say yes. Why do I recommend that? Well, much like the minimum capacity, maximum capacity thing, you can always ask for it now and determine later on down the road that when you get ready to file your Form 471, you decide, no, we don't want those services. But if you say, no, you don't want those services, and then you get to the Form 471, you realize, dag nabbit, we really wanted insulation. Too late. You'd either have to go back out with a new Form 470, which probably at that time would be too late, which means you'd have to wait another year or more. So, build yourself in the flexibility of saying yes to this now on the Form 470 so that you can then have your flexibility later when you might be closer to realizing whether or not you actually do want installation, activation, and or initial configuration for that service. Check off the RFPs that apply, checked off the placeholder, and then we should be good to go. We're going to add this service request, and it's going to take us right back to our narrative page. That's really how easy this is with respect to the leased lit fiber. Now, in the narrative, I would probably want to mention locations that are going to be served, speeds sought. Let's see, what else would we want? Perhaps distances. I'm trying to think of anything else. Other special considerations that may make you or your situation unique, or anything else that's going to help get you. Oh, and disqualifications. That last one is a really, really important one, if I could spell it right. And that is a really, really important one as well. If you have anything in your bid evaluation process that is going to result in an automatic disqualification of a bid, considered non-responsive, for example, if there are such disqualifications, they need to be listed in the narrative. The idea here is that at least USAC is telling everybody, you need to make sure that that a vendor can look at this narrative and realize right away, we don't qualify for this, so that you're essentially saving them the time of having to go through the process of putting together a bid package and delivering it to you, only to have it rejected simply because it didn't meet one of the basic qualifications. With that in mind, your basic qualifications need to be listed here in the narrative, not just contained within your bid evaluation documentation. Are you seeking an installment plan? Probably not. You can if you want. This is a little bit less important in terms of the now versus later, but it still could be one of those things where you decide later, well, that would be pretty nice. And if you said no, you wouldn't have the option to do that later. So if you want to have a bidder potentially provide you with an installment plan option, you would certainly say yes. Now, that having been said, just be aware that just because you ask for the installment payment option does not necessarily mean that a vendor has to provide it for you. So just be aware that there is that as you make this kind of request. You wouldn't make this a disqualification because they are not required to allow you to amortize over a certain number of years. But you can see then, obviously, you have the drop-down menu to request as many years as up to 4 that you may have. And then, yeah, and this is basically just a range as well from 1 to 4 years. And then would you prefer annual or monthly payments? And then you can put those in there as well. That is the crux of a simple example on a Form 470. Your details in terms of spelling out what it is you're requiring or what it is you're asking for will go in your narrative to be very specific. in terms of guiding districts. Um, and then moving on, the process is fairly similar with respect to category 2. You add a service request. Here you're going to start by identifying whether it is internal connections, basic maintenance, or managed internal broadband services. I think in most cases you're probably going to be looking for internal connections or basic maintenance. I'll just use the internal connections at this point as the example. We will not use the example of switches and routers, since those would fall under the auspices of the state's Form 470. We'll talk about filing against the state's Form 470 when we get to the 471 application training, which will occur in January. Correct me, Jody, if I'm wrong, but I think that's the 11th of January.
I'd have to go back and look at the exact dates. It's sometime that first or second week there in January, I believe. Yeah.
December, January.
Yeah, we'll get that date.
Yeah, I think it's the 13th.
Okay.
Excuse me. Yeah, don't save. Yeah. All right. So, yeah, when we get to the January, we'll talk about it, and we will run through applying for services based off of the state's Form 470. But in this case, there may be things that you need that aren't on a state Form 470 that don't have state contracts. And so, for example, that might include cabling or wiring within your building. Notice that it wants an estimation of the total number of feet of wiring that you need. So you might need a new run between your MDF and your IDFs in your high school, and you've got 3 IDFs, and it's approximately 150 feet between each one running back from the IDF to the MDF, which would be approximately 450 feet of cabling. You want to make sure that you continue to say no preference on your manufacturer. Notice that if you do have a manufacturer preference, you do still have conveniently the words "or equivalent" added next to each of these. Now, obviously, each of these is more suited towards the providers of equipment rather than like a service of installing cabling. But there may be lighting, electronics, et cetera, that you might need that would fall under these, that would also it lend itself toward your selecting one or the other. I won't single anybody out, but you saw that HP, I'm sure Dell or Enterasys Extreme, and I'm sure whomever else may or may not end up on the state contracts would also be in here as well for down the road. But you can just simply leave it at no preference, and then move on to other things. And particularly for something like cabling or wiring, internal wiring, it may make perfect sense to leave that with no specific preference whatsoever. The number of entities served. This is basically your number of building entities, whether it's internal to a building or multiple buildings being served by the same piece of equipment. You would just indicate the number that's included there. Once again, we have this, are you seeking installation, activation, initial config? Again, I recommend saying yes on that rather than no, to give yourself that built-in flexibility for future decisions, and then click add. And it has brought us back to the category 2 funding requests and the narrative. And again, here's where we're going to put details of the project. And here's where I would be as detailed as I can possibly be within reason, in order to help spell out to any potential bidders what it is that you really need within your building. Again, you may have some support documentation that would go along with this. You can add multiple RFP related documents so that you might reference You may need a map of the building to show where the routes are that you need, or where the existing cable tray is, to help a potential bidder to provide you with the full cost breakdown of what it's going to require them to, or what's going to cost to require them, or to meet your requirements. Excuse me. So you want to be as detailed as possible there in your narrative as well. That's sort of the high level demonstration. And I think at this point, while Jody is probably going to be looking at any additional questions that you've got, I will just put in a really quick plug, not only for our January Form 471 session, but also for the next 2 days. Associated or attached to our announcements about this session and about last week's and January session were invitations to what we are referring to as office hours. Our office hours are essentially the idea is that we're going to have a drop-in session. We are going to open up a Teams meeting, and at I believe tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning, and I'm just going to be sitting in front of my computer and probably working on other things while there's nobody around, but hopefully we'll have folks drop in and ask questions. And that's really what it's designed to do, is to give you an opportunity to just jump in, say, hey, Scott, I've got this real quick question. I didn't want to ask it yesterday or during such and such session, just because, it was really specific to my situation. I didn't want to bother y'all with that. Sure, great. So please feel free to drop in anytime between 10 and 2 tomorrow. We also have time on Friday set aside from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m., trying to give some flexibility in terms of what works best for you all. We will also be doing that again after our January Form 471 training. And I will throw out a really quick kudos to Courtney DeRosset from our CATS engineer from Region 8, who I think she sort of borrowed the idea from some folks in her region to have that office hours idea. I think it's a really neat idea, and I hope that folks will take advantage of it as we go forward. All right, with that all in mind, Jody, I want to jump over to you and ask you if you see any questions specifically.
Yeah, there's a few things. I appreciate I think it's 10 to noon Eastern tomorrow, right? And then 1 to 3 on Friday. Is that what you had? You had a couple of 2-hour blocks for those office hours.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's fine. And as Scott said, I think they've always been, Scott Caprice has been more than willing to work with districts individually. They're still willing to do that. If you've got some times that don't work along the side of those office hours, this was just an opportunity to maybe just schedule something in advance to show that we want to be available to help districts. And so just scheduling those at specific times, if you can drop in. Obviously, it's akin to them being there at the KISTI conference, available just for folks that walk by as needed. It's very similar to that. And hopefully, if we've got situations that we didn't cover today, stop in at one of those times. We'll take advantage of it. Shouldn't surprise you, Scott, that the comment that rocketed to the top of the social Q&A was just a kudos to you and Caprice. Said a huge help to districts, greatly appreciated, certainly well deserved. And as I said, you guys have been great to work with and great to help with districts. I tease Scott at times because he's kind of he's the choir boy when it comes to the advice he's going to give. He's definitely going to stick to the book, but he should do that, right? Because it's not, it's what I tell districts. I don't get to hand out the money and I don't come take it back. And so the Scott's the same way, right? So when in doubt, we're going to give you a pretty conservative answer on those things, and that's to be expected. I may have missed a couple of these. There's a lot of questions that have come up. I've tried to either answer them in the chat window or bring them up to you, Scott. Somebody pointed out, if they know they're going to be leaving, and someone else is going to be handling E-rate, like what's the best plan of attack? I think probably go ahead and, if you know who that's going to be, give them an account in Epic. You'll eventually make them an administrator when the time is right. I have tried unsuccessfully to get a no retirements during COVID mandate passed, but I know that's not happening, and I understand that. I had somebody ask, I know the answer, but I said I would ask, can we use last year's enrollment for one school, but this year's enrollment for another school?
No.
Yeah.
I, I don't recommend it. I don't recommend
No,
it.
we need to stay consistent across
Yeah.
one year for that.
Yep.
Let's see. Somebody did ask, will you compile the office hours questions and send out if they might apply to most of us? I think that's a
Oh,
fair
certainly.
request.
That's a very good idea.
Okay. So I knew this. I wondered if this would come up. Let me check my specific text. So somebody put in here, I want to use the state filed 470 for Cat 2 hardware. I noticed the state contracts for those expire this coming February 2021. Can you address this? I know that the topic of the new networking contracts has been a popular one. I asked Mike specifically if this came up, what can we say about that? And I'll just read directly. We expect the RFP to be released soon, resulting contracts to be available for the E-rate application window. We will keep districts advised and will provide additional guidance direction as needed. I know that is the intent. And, what I would say there, if you've got needs that are going to be based on that, we have advised in the past, like if you've got, for example, a category 1 networking equipment need that might be related to dark fiber or self-provisioned fiber, you would be doing your own 470 in that example, but you could put the caveat that I'm going to be awarding this to providers that are part of the CETS contracts as per our CETS standards, and that way you could keep you from maybe considering bids that you might not otherwise want to consider. Check the questions again real quick and make sure I'm not missing anything. When should we have detailed information regarding Cat 2 budgets? So I think we've made an effort to address that today. I may need to get a little more clarification about what specifically we're getting at there in terms of detailed information. I will say, I hope Andy and Megan have been putting this in along the way. We've been answering these questions via Go Soapbox. Go Soapbox at the app.gosoapbox.com is the site, and the code is 470 E-rate, 470 E-rate, lowercase. I got a couple of poll questions. I may throw those up here in just a second. Some folks have been kind enough to respond as I was having fun with that, trying to just get some interaction. Very generally speaking, I think we've hit the big areas of discussion were around how to handle area technology centers, how to handle that 10 school guideline breaking point when it comes to establishing Cat 2 budgets. I think we've gotten most of those squared away, but if we need to go back and do any review on those, we certainly can. But those have been probably the biggest conversation points that I've seen.
Okay. So it sounds like, at least for now, we've pretty much covered things as need be.
I would like to think so. Yeah.
Okay.
I guess if people have responded, they can they might have curiosity, and you probably can see the results if I pull up the poll questions there. What best describes your status on the E-rate season? Most people, I think, felt somewhat prepared. Always want to try to get an opportunity for training, and then it was kind of an even split between others saying that they pretty much had it covered versus those that really just felt kind of lost. But for most, from most perspective, people were tuning in just to get some training. This one kind of surprised me. Of the 30 responses we had so far, half have said that they expect a pretty significant E-rate filing year. A lot of components in need of an upgrade, and then smaller amounts, and only 20% saying that they were in pretty good shape. A lot of that obviously depends on when you got your Category 2 filing for previous years and relative age of your equipment. Certainly need to know your budget and know your needs, and this is, to me, is kind of the kickoff of getting those discussions started.
Good.
But beyond that, if we need to go over anything again with the area technology centers, we might hit that one more time. I think just to clarify, Scott, you would be entering 0 in that enrollment data unless you have one of those facilities that actually do have students enrolled there.
That's exactly right.
And then as far as the issues with the school counts, I know some people have been trying to maybe fudge that a little bit, but if you have more than 10 instructional facilities, and that would include an area technology center, and that would include some of these smaller alternative learning scenarios, if that gets you up to 11, then you would be in that bucket where we can't break it out by school. We have to just count the total enrollment for the district. And I know we've got some one-offs on each of those. I encourage you to jump in on one of the office hours that we've got upcoming, or ask those questions offline, either to Scott or Caprice or to your field staff rep, and we'll obviously work together on those and try to get you some guidance there. I will tell you, Scott, and you probably would say the same thing. I did get a tip from one of the teammates. We try to, without giving specific guidance, trying to tell people exactly what they must do, we try to sort of give advice as best we can. One thing that's come up when you're establishing RFPs, if you're doing an RFP for maybe fiber to your outlying schools and you're trying to have that RFP extend over a lengthy period of time, definitely worthwhile to have some sort of clarifying plan of attack for if a school were to open or close. Because
Yes.
We've had some situations where, you maybe 2 years into a 5-year contract, the district decides to close the school, and you're in the midst of a contract. What do I do? We have unfortunately had a couple of occasions where providers try to say, well, you contracted for 5 years. We built out all this fiber. You got to keep paying for that, even though the building's not connected. So, things like that definitely worth clarifying as part of your RFP that you might release. And you may have mentioned, I was answering questions in Soapbox. If in the 470 portion there, you're putting that breakdown of minimum and maximum speed, you want your RFP to match that as well. Because I do know at times reviewers can come back and say, well, you said you wanted 1 to 10 gig here, but you only said 10 gig in the RFP. And so if they don't match up, that can probably get you in some hot water with PI review as well. So watch out for things like that.
Yep.
Those are some of the big things that I think have come up either via text or Soapbox or other things. I will stop and check again. And if you've got any closing comments, Scott, or if you do want to run through that thing about creating and asking USAC to create an entity for you, I guess we could do that as well.
Yeah, I really.
If you want to do that in office hours, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, really, what it comes down to in terms of creating an entity is going to be calling Client Services Bureau. 888-203-8100. And I'll say that again, just because, you're supposed to repeat the number at least, 3 times for folks to remember it. 888-203-8100. That's, call now, 888-203-8100. Yeah, the folks at Client Services Bureau will walk you through the process. They'll set up the initial building within Epic, and they'll probably ask you for a few clarifying questions, what kind of school, just to get the basics set up before then turning it back over to you so that you can enter any discount data, et cetera, et cetera. Beyond that, any closing comments? Well, first of all, I want to just thank everybody for hanging on and joining us. And also just the plug again for the office hours sessions tomorrow and Friday. And then also the Form 471 session that's scheduled for January, and encourage you to not only to take part in those, but also don't hesitate. Please don't hesitate to give us a call, drop us an email. Any of us are more than happy to help you through this process and make it as at least as smooth as possible. It's never a smooth process where E-rate is concerned, but certainly can be made a little bit smoother. And we're here to sort of be the shock absorbers, perhaps a little bit for you all in making that ride a little bit more comfortable as we get through this. So with that, encourage you to be in touch, and certainly we will be. And at this point, I think I'll draw things to a close and just thank Andy and Megan for making this happen and doing their magic. And we'll see you, if nothing else, we'll see you again in January. Thank you all very much. Take care.